Hey guys, previews for Avowed started to appear with several YouTubers and mainstream media channels showcasing some gameplay footage. One of the reasons why I decided to make this video is that there is some weird discrepancy between what is showed in that footage and what is said by commentators. Sometimes those two things kind of contradict each other, and I don't see many people expressing my own real impressions from what I see on the screen. So here we go. We're gonna analyze available clips from several people like MrMattyPlays, SkillUp, Mortismal Gaming, Force Gaming, pick up on some hints we might get, and make our own mind on whether it's gonna be a bad flop, forgettable average, or the next big mega blockbuster hit game. Even though we might poke some holes into some previews and disagree on some opinions, please keep it light-hearted and civil and don't insult content creators who made these previews if you don't agree with them. It's gonna be a lengthy video, so make a coffee or a tea, make yourself comfortable, and let us go. But first, disclaimer from the future. A big scandal with Obsidian Entertainment happened shortly after I started working on this video, so by this time, when you see the video, the question of whether you should get this game in an official way kind of solved itself out. Unless Obsidian Entertainment and their Microsoft overlords make a significant change in their policies, and unless they address their anti-consumer employees, there is no need to sponsor them with your money. This being said, significant part of this channel is still dedicated to game reviews and analysis, so after some consideration I still thought that we can talk about previews for Avowed and discuss them, even though game got into that not recommended for purchase list. Back to the video. There is a somewhat strange vibe in previews I saw, with people often claiming that they had low expectations, with reviewers comparing this very new and really expensive game to some much older titles to draw some positive conclusions, and then some folks comparing it to flopped projects as if being better than them is somehow a great achievement.
I had very modest expectations for this one. I went into this with low expectations about combat.
Wow, I didn't really have many expectations going into this one.
I was pleasantly surprised by that.
But the fact is that this game costs whopping $70 or euros, which means that publishers send us a clear signal that this game is worth more money than Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Stalker 2, and even Elden Ring. So this is a bar this game has to overcome, a bar set by price tag. This is not a game pitched as a AA project, no, this is a game that should blow you away. So instead of using unquantifiable expectations, I would rather see people who are previewing this game measure it against a quantifiable thing, which is a price. Because it's obvious that game that costs you $20 deserves more leniency compared to a lot more expensive game. And when you tell me that your game is more valuable than Elden Ring, well, I'm gonna approach it with very high expectations. So with this in mind, let us start it. First of all, visuals, art direction, graphics, etc.
Especially for a game like this, which isn't exactly pushing the visual envelope. Avowed is capped at 30 FPS on consoles, and honestly, that really blows. I'm really into how this game looks, like I love its art design, but like I said, it's not reaching for a level of graphical fidelity that you'd look at and go, oh, okay, I can see why you can't get this running at 60 FPS on a console. Like, it's just not that. And
really pretty game, and I mean, just it's a looker in general. I mentioned this in my first preview as well back in August, but I feel even more sure of it now that this is Obsidian's best looking game yet, and I definitely think it is one of the better looking games I've seen in recent memory. The world, the character models, the lighting, it's just really well done.
as I was saying, I really like how this game looks. I love its architecture, I love its color palette, I love its flora and fauna, especially the stuff on my face. It's a very whimsical fantasy, so much so that many people felt let down by its visual design when Obsidian pivoted away from the darker tone that the first reveal trailer had. Personally, I like the swinging for their own unique thing here, and I think it's working really well.
It has that popular and rather typical colorful fantasy vibe to it. It is an Unreal Engine 5 game, so engine does some heavy lifting in certain areas, and you can see that distinct, let's say, engine accent in some cases. My first impression from the style is that I would not call it particularly interesting, rather generically pretty. As for overall uniqueness, see, here are screenshots from this game, some other games, and some Unreal Engine assets available for purchase. And as you can see, it is hardly a unique outlook. SkillUp says game swinging for its own unique thing here. Yeah, it is swinging somewhere, but I would not really say that there is anything unique here, to be honest. This color palette and graphic style was extremely popular for years in fantasy genre, and even though it generally looks nice and I like this type of visuals overall, it's pretty much yet another iteration of the same style used in multitudes of fantasy games. And as I mentioned, it also has this Unreal Engine 5 kind of vibe to it, which you can see better if we compare this game with Immortals of Avium, another Unreal Engine 5 game with a fantasy theme. Also, I don't like this infamous purple slash violet slash pinkish vomit. For some reason, this game seems to love to throw these colors at you, and you will see it all the time. Another thing I don't like is that it feels like the whole world is covered in wax, or as if there is a matte plastic filter applied to almost everything. The problem is that this sort of filter creates waxy faces, and also it kind of messes up metals and they start to look like cheap props. And you see some examples on the screen, you know, like glass is kind of ruined, the rims of the shields are ruined, everything looks plasticky. And here SkillUp shows a bit of Veilguard, and ironically even super stylized Veilguard's medals look better than medals we see in some of the Avowed scenes. Visual effects. For my taste they look okay, but I'm rather tolerant to this style. They certainly lack any sort of threatening or dreadful vibe to them. They look kind of almost too cheerful, so this might feel as a downside to people who prefer darker undertone of visual effects. Here we see some water. Yes, still water looks pretty good, but running water looks very outdated. I also don't particularly like splashes. Yeah, I don't like them at all. Animations. Animations don't seem to be that impressive. First of all, third person has a lot of weirdness to it, up to the point that even some reviewers said that they probably won't be playing it as it looks kind of lame.
The jogging animation has a little, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I call it the poopy pants run, where you're kind of like waddling around like, oh man, don't want this to fall down my leg. It reminds me a lot of that. So I might end up just kind of going first person only in this, especially when you combine it with the performance dips. And also for me, I thought the VFX were far more effective when you were in first person. It felt like way more epic.
And I have to agree, right? Like the third person is not particularly viable. Like you can play it, but it just doesn't look cool. Climbing animations in third person looks very funny. Jumps look like characters levitating. Running with weapons kind of meh. Not a huge fan of gun powering with some magic crap. I don't know, just would prefer powering up to be part of a gun's mechanism instead of looking this magical. Combat animations, kind of average. Companions fighting animation and stands, both pretty cheap looking. Sometimes it looks like it's just broken or he is just unresponsive. So here, for example, just take a look at the companion fighting some enemies. Yeah, that's what I mean. Now, before we get to combat, we have to clarify one thing. Even though, according to devs, Avowed was always developed with both third and first person view in mind, I gotta say that so far it seems that combat-wise it can only be competitive as first person fantasy RPG. As soon as you bring in third-person competitors into comparison, Avowed starts to look quite miserable, especially in its melee combat department. There are so many games with great melee combat for third-person view that whatever little Avowed has in that department looks like a joke.
And I promise you, Avowed will exceed your expectations. Swing animations feel weighty without being clunky, the brief slowdown when you land a blow feels really satisfying, enemies will react really convincingly to each strike and ragdoll appropriately, there's a dodge button that makes combat feel really light-footed, there's charged attacks that will deal bonus damage or shatter enemy shields, and you can deal a devastating combo attack whenever you deplete an enemy's stamina. As you can see, I was playing a caster here, which was very sort of Harry Potter-esque, where my wand was doing all the basic attack work, and I could bring up a book of spells for bigger damage, but this is by no means the only way to play. You have 2 weapon loadouts you can switch between on the fly, and so I was also rocking a mace and shield at times. That felt fantastic too.
So SkillUp says that Avowed will exceed your expectation on first-person combat, but to be honest, nothing in his footage looks that interesting or new. Like, he shows repetitive shots from wand and talks about how satisfying combat feels. Yeah, I don't know. Or he goes on counting on how many great things there are, yet literally everything from this list would be considered as a baseline for combat-oriented action game. So there's just this discrepancy on how much he tries to hype this game up and how little new there is to it. It's not like I'm gonna be, oh, this game has power attack. Oh wow, oh wait, power attack interacts with shields. Damn, what a crazy game.
I fought spiders and goblins and humans and just a really nice smattering of foes, and that was all just in the first zone. I mean, that's pretty impressive, right?
Absolutely not. Again, this is what I mean. Sometimes they state some absolutely normal, basic things and then would go on how it's so wild and impressive.
Honestly though, I think watching this footage doesn't really sell how good it feels, and neither does me explaining it to you.
A lot more impactful than it looks, which is a hard thing to convey over video.
So Mortismal says that recording of combat makes it look worse than in reality. Well, while recording does typically rob part of the impression, it's also undeniable that games with really good combat look very good on recording too. Go watch Elden Ring combat footage, for example. When animations and timings are good, when enemies react properly and there are enough visual and audio clues, when hits affect environment, etc., combat will look good on recording. If it looks bad in video, that's probably because combat in Avowed seems to be just average.
I was pleasantly surprised by that. But let's talk about...
Pleasantly surprised? But why surprised? Do $70 games come with trash combat and you get all surprised when it's better than that?
The combat in Avowed feels pretty darn good. If we're continuing to make comparisons to Skyrim, which I get probably getting tired by now, it feels leagues better than that, like substantially better. I mostly played melee, going with this fighter build, primarily using a shield as well as a one-handed weapon, although I was starting to make use of ranged more.
So Force Gaming compares Avowed's combat to unmodded Skyrim, an almost 14 years old game made by a company not really known for the greatest melee combat to begin with. Yeah, not sure about this kind of approach. While I do agree that it looks better than vanilla Skyrim, this is pretty low bar to set. This is one of those cop-outs I see in many videos. Everyone explains how they had low expectations or how they gonna compare it to much older games, as if this should influence your perception in a positive way, when in reality it kind of makes you more cautious. In order to make Avowed melee combat look good, you have to compare it only to Bethesda melee combat, so it has to stay in this very narrow scope of first-person fantasy RPG, because as soon as you venture to, let's say, a futuristic RPGs or hack-and-slash games or anywhere else, Avowed combat gets completely wrecked. But the funny thing is that there were games in first-person fantasy RPG genre that had a lot more creativity in them than this $70 ultra-modern game backed by freaking Microsoft. Here is a footage from almost 20 years old game called Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Look at how much more creative this game gets with combat, how much fun it has, instead of going for purely generic stuff. If someone would create a high budget remake of this game today, it would absolutely slaughter competition. The amount of interactivity it had puts to shame a lot of modern games.
Now, Avowed does support multiple equipment builds, so you don't have to make too many tough decisions. At least in the early going, you get to switch between two equipment loadouts. So I kind of had my ranged weapon option and my close range weapon option. There's two examples I wanted to call out. Might, which impacts your damage, and then Dexterity, which impacts your attack speed. So you could build to kind of rush these two and just have a character that can wield a typically slow swinging weapon with much greater efficiency.
Also felt great. I'm really excited by how free-form the class design and combat model is in Avowed, because it is going to be possible to combine magic, melee, and range weapons to arrive at a unique fighting style, and because each of these elements feels so good to use, it's going to be nice to move freely between the three of them.
Matt talks about two weapon loadout or strength and dexterity builds. Nothing to complain about, of course, but this all sounds extremely common. SkillUp goes on about combining magic and melee builds and how exciting it is to have that freedom. Again, good to mention it to reassure gamers that the game doesn't lock you in one path, but I can't help but notice that this is more like a norm in a world where first-person fantasy RPGs were shaped by Elder Scrolls series years ago and they never locked you anyway. This is one of those cases where I just fail to feel as excited as those reviewers pretend to be, because what they are describing is just so mundane. Build and abilities. Most of the skills are covered by Mortismal Gaming video on skills, where he goes on to read description of all unlockable skills. I'm not gonna play all of this, and we'll just highlight interesting stuff and make an overall conclusion, and there's a link in a description to that video. Fighter build consists of many passive or triggered status effect skills for crits, stun, damage increase, stamina bleed, HP improving skills, etc. Active skills are shield bash, charge, taunt, shield reflect, power jump, self buff / interrupt shout. And at the top of the tree there is a whirlwind attack and a revival of companions. So yeah, this does look like a better variety than vanilla Skyrim had for active skills. Well, at least on paper, unless they butcher it with animations or bad hitboxes and stuff. But you can see what I mean when I said that it's only competitive in that limited scope of first-person fantasy RPGs, so that we don't compete with combat-oriented third-person RPGs or hack-and-slasher, where this kind of arsenal doesn't look particularly impressive at all. Ranger. Ranger has passive skills related to one-handed weapon and bows, guns, damage increase, critical chance, dodge, stamina cost reduction, aiming, slow motion, potion efficiency, scavenging / crafting boons, equipment switching speed, more stun from ranged weapons. Active skills are root, parry, invisibility, a slide with knockdown effect, block arrows, summon animal, and a self buff. Ranger feels kind of average so far. Apart from slide, everything seems to be quite cliche. It could be that smart cooldown policies and combination of mobility and weapon specifics may still create an engaging combat akin to first-person shooters maybe, but it's hard to feel excited about most of these skills specifically, and game footage for this class is very limited. wizards. They have armor passives, enhancement of wand power attacks, some resource manipulation like using health instead of mana, wand damage, magic missile, frost, fire, electricity, poison with vampiric effect, summon stuff, damage absorption or damage reduction, shockwave, knockback, summon magical spear to use, summon bow, spell that pulls enemies, I guess to set them up for a nuke. Now, I love to see at least a couple of those extras in Wizard's arsenal, like those summon weapons kind of spells, because other than that, it's all pretty generic and mostly just variations of typical fantasy elemental spells, like your most basic fantasy starter pack. Feels disappointing not to see any creature summon spells for wizards, not to have any mind control or enemy manipulation type of spells, no telekinetic spells, no teleportation, no spell reflect, no levitation, no underwater breathing, no NPC manipulation with charm or enrage, no invisibility, not even a silence spell. The only spell and its effect that caught my attention was Frost spell's interaction with water, like with bodies of water, that creates platforms on water and allows you to step on that platform to get somewhere. Reminded me Dragon's Dogma icy platforms or Magicka's interactivity where you could both melt ice with fire or freeze water with frost spells. Would be nice to see more stuff like this, where environment matters. I don't know whether they're gonna have some scrolls or item related spells in the game to make it look less barren, but so far Magic's system looks very bare bone, considering that Wizard's Mage is typically one of those classes that should allow you to go crazy with some fun stuff. Like if we mentioned Bethesda games, yeah, melee combat was super basic in, for example, Morrowind. But the amount of schools of magic and spells it had, and the amount of fun you could have with that was incredible. But 22 years later, we have come to this, which feels kind of lackluster. This is what you get for $70 right now. But overall, the question whether this is all gonna be fun can't be fully answered with these previews. Not only because you can only imagine how those skills play in practice, the whole experience gonna be tied to overall design, type of enemies, difficulty settings, enemy resistances or lack of such, hitboxes, AI, item progression, boss design, and multitude of other factors that aren't really covered in previews. By the way, it is worth mentioning that since this game comes from Xbox environment, there is one extra factor in play, that is all those console wars, fanboyism and tribalism and stuff, which usually means that people who love certain consoles tend to overhype games that originate from related environment. And this is something completely irrelevant to PC gamers because we won't have that hype and we don't really care whether this game adds something to PlayStation's or Xbox choices and variety. And it's like with Starfield, their management was hyping this game as a great milestone for Xbox, but I don't personally care whether it is the best space game available on Xbox, because it just was not a good game on PC, and we have such a big variety and serious competition. So when we look at games like Avowed as a PC gamers, we might feel like there is a lot of excessive hype that will never correlate with our actual experience. Anyway, to the next point. Characters, NPCs, companions.
Unfortunately, at least in my time with the game, he did not seem particularly useful in combat. In fact, he seemed to die quite a bit, and it didn't always feel like he was making much of an impact.
Now, the featured companion, Kai, seems to be kind of bad in terms of how he moves, what he does, and I'm not a big fan of his rubber face and a deadman gaze. Good thing is that apparently you can have some interesting conversation with him, according to some reviewers.
All here is going to be having a chat with your party members, so I got to sit down and talk with Kai, and this is a good time to highlight something I mentioned in my first preview of Avowed, which is that the conversations in this game can be very long in a good way. Like, I love that when I'm choosing to settle down and have a chat with one of my party members that we can really get into the weeds of it. Like, we were just recapping all the things that happened since we first met, and then there were plenty of questions afterwards that I could have asked Kai just to learn more about him, learn more about this world. And I just love how, similar to an older BioWare game, I can just dive deep into these characters and spend a lot of time talking to them. So I really enjoyed those moments of respite, especially because
NPC characters seem to be on a boring side so far, with their voxy faces and generic looks. No idea if this is what they are going with in general throughout the whole game, or is it just some throwaway NPCs for a starting zone. But they don't have a $70 game look to them. UI, menus, etc. I really don't like this game's combat UI. It feels as if it was ripped from some other game, another genre. Doesn't fit fantasy style at all. With all that green tint and bars, it kind of reminds me games about spaceships and futuristic vehicles with their navigation screens, power systems and stuff. Force Gaming felt similar way.
As for my feedback or the things that I'm not loving so far, probably one of the biggest ones is the UI, specifically the combat-related UI, like enemy health bars and the damage pop-up numbers. They seem really out of place with the rest of the game. Like, they seem out of place with the immersion and the environment and the world, and they even seem out of place with the rest of the UI. The combat UI, combat-related UI, I got used to it, but it really stuck out to me initially as like, whoa, I don't think this looks good. It doesn't jive. Something wasn't clicking with me.
Writing, dialogues, player choices and such.
Since my background is one of intuition and insight, I was regularly offered dialogue options that let me point out things that would have been otherwise missed, or let me advance the conversation more quickly because I could sense which way things were going.
SkillUp gives example of game responding to your choice. I guess it's nice. I don't know if it makes me think hell yeah, $70 game stuff, but okay.
If you have the right stats, or you choose the right dialogue options, or you have the right background. It's a game where you can just shortcut the chit-chat and head straight to Boomtown if you're spoiling for a fight. It's a game where you can be an asshole to your companions, or random people you meet and they will respond in kind.
Choice. But so far it seems pretty basic. Are we gonna pretend that a fight or talk kind of choice is an innovation in RPG genre?
And it's impossible for me to not notice just how much Avowed is delivering in ways that Dragon Age did not. Like, I want the dialogue options available to me to reflect the decisions that I made.
Using Veilguard as a comparison for choices, again, very low bar considering that it was a game that spectacularly failed in this department, so why choose it for comparison when you talk about this very expensive game? I don't want to go there buying games that are better than failures if I'm paying $70. I want to go there knowing that it is better than successful games of similar price category.
Impressed by the quality of the writing. The writing here just pops. It really does. It's full of insight and wit, and it's funny.
We have a problem, all right? And I've got the solution tucked in my sheath.
Unless you're hearing that from a handsome stranger in the bathhouse, that's usually an invitation to trouble.
To be perfectly honest, the writing was the part of Avowed that I loved the most. Every new character or NPC I'd meet, I could be confident that they'd have their own unique voice. I don't mean voice as in voice acting, I mean voice as in personality.
SkillUp goes on praising its writing and its humor and wit and such. Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't think it's good writing. I don't think it's a funny jokes. Some dialogue options are just outright cliche and even lame. Yeah, that's just excessive amount of hyping up. Exploration and world. Well, apparently exploration is on a good level here.
Starters, exploration seems very fun. Like, there's so much stuff you can go and see and do, and it's very open. Now, this system, if you're unaware, is going to be similar to Obsidian's previous work, Outer Worlds, but bigger by comparison. So the game is not truly open world, but rather you will have several large hubs that serve as different areas of the game you can traverse.
Later. So you can't just go complete unhinged exploration, but there is a lot of fulfilling stuff to find.
There's a massive subterranean temple that's loaded with enemies, puzzles, bosses, a nefarious NPC who's got some ulterior motives, and a shrine to one of the old gods. And that is just 6 of the, count them, 35 named points of interest in the Dawnlands alone. Like I said, there's a lot here. You are practically tripping over interesting locations at every turn. And as you've probably noticed as well in the footage...
The real question right now is whether Preview Zone, which might be a part of marketing campaign, marketing strategy, represents the game as a whole. This is why some reviewers were mentioning their experience with other games where they thought that their preview experience was good, but the full game experience was very different.
I will caveat all of this excitement by saying that even 6 hours with a game like this is still not very much time. I mean, I remember playing through the Final Fantasy 16 preview build, and I loved that, but the rest of the game just didn't deliver for me. That's a thing that can happen with previews for big, ambitious, lengthy RPGs.
Also, while reviewers mention that you can find loot and it rewards your exploration efforts and such, they don't really go into details on how it affects your game. In my opinion, one of the things that usually makes exploration truly rewarding is when loot plays nicely into game progression. On the contrary, there are games flooding you with vendor trash and you just stop bothering with exploring at some point. So what I would love to hear whether finding stuff actually changes something in your gameplay. You know how in Elden Ring, for example, a seemingly random castle and its boss can reward you with a game-changing weapon that suddenly opens new possibilities. That's what I'm talking about. Also, Force Gaming, who was talking about how there are a lot of points of interest, later clarifies that most points of interest don't really have enemies or particularly engaging or interactive content, so I assume his previous mention of good points of interest density is mostly about places that have some kind of structure or a cave or a hidden path and a loot, rather than being a places where there are some kind of meaningful interactions with world or NPCs.
So add that as much as I really enjoy exploring in the play space, the world does feel a little static. It is densely packed with points of interest, but it's also kind of light on enemies. There will be some locations, some of the points of interest, and specifically the dungeons, will have rather large groups, and there are some enemy camps that are pretty highly dense in number of enemies, but the spaces in between and a lot of the smaller points of interest are pretty much empty. I would love to see more enemy density, even if it was just an option.
While the level designs seem to be pretty good, at least from what is shown, game is absolutely abusing handholding.
About how they had to use certain light accessibility features in order to make things more clear. In particular, they wanted to really signpost the main path through the game. So
another note in the dislikes or the cons would be that the game is pretty darn handholdy. The puzzles have all been very easy. The traversal locations are quite obvious. Any climbable area will either have ropes hanging from it or have some sort of paint on them. Even the loot and treasure is pretty easy to find because it all makes this kind of glittery, glistening sound.
The amount of those ropes they put on every scalable place is actually pretty ridiculous. Just look at that, they really don't believe in their players. It's kind of funny. Even more ropes. In fact, there is some rope vomit going on in this game. Actually, it's not even funny anymore, it just starts to really bother me at this point.
There isn't much brain power required for exploring the space or for finding secrets, but
performance and some extras.
Performance, gotta say, was a bit all over the place. This is also probably one of the bigger negatives. The first day of playing, it was rather choppy.
The thing that concerns me was the micro stuttering.
Having said that, playing on an RTX 4090 4K max settings, ray tracing on, DLSS set to quality, I was getting around about 60 FPS out in the wilds and around 30 to 40 FPS in town, so a pretty big drop there.
Dawn Shore, it is very pretty, but I was seeing the world loading in right before my eyes, just sets of trees, buildings, things were constantly loading in before me. Fortunately, we do have a few months until the games are released where that is something I can imagine is ironed out. However, this doesn't scream to me, yeah, the game was pretty good to go, but we just wanted to give it a few extra months because that's better for our players. The frame rate does dip a decent amount when you're in third person as well. It's definitely below 60 FPS, not coming close to 30, at least in my experience with playing on my PC, which has a 3080 8-core processor and 32 gigabytes.
Wokeness and ideology. There is not much to discuss here at the moment, as the information we have in previews is quite disjointed and limited, and most reviewers show the same stuff and the same dialogues. You get those ridiculous pronounces and character screen, you get some women soldier stuff going on here and there, but I would need to see the whole thing to give some definite conclusions on how bad it actually is. A note from future. In addition to previews, we also got a scandal with some Obsidian employees being anti-white racists and saying that the game will be catering to woke audiences. There were many videos on it, including on my channel, so I won't repeat all of this here, but yes, there are high chances that game is infested in some ways, according to developers themselves. We don't know how much influence on game content those specific psychopaths have, but it is a good reason to wait for reviews from people who are known for their anti-woke positions. Conclusion. Now, so far, it doesn't blow my mind and hardly justifies steep price. I don't see anything super fun, I don't see anything innovative. My overall impression is that it is closer to philosophy of safe remakes, not much creativity, just some shiny new product to sell. What we don't know is whether the shown content is representative of the whole game. We don't know if the rest of the game is roughly the same, or it is better, or it is worse.
I'm surprised by how much I was impressed by Avowed, but thinking it through, I really shouldn't be surprised. Like, this is Obsidian we're talking about.
Yeah, and a month before it was BioWare. What he forgets to mention is that Obsidian has lost absolute majority of people who worked on their older legendary titles, so while formally it is Obsidian, in the same time it's not quite the same thing.
Past day one. And frankly, in order for this to justify that price tag, I think the game would have to knock it out of the park, because increased prices come with increased expectation.
Mortismal is concerned whether the game justifies price, and rightly so, because when you go to the market claiming that your game has more value than genre-defining games of the year, you better deliver some outstanding performance. Kind of strange that price was not addressed by any other reviewers I watched. Matt recognizes that he might be overly optimistic and mentions Whaleguard.
So there's a lot here. I'm definitely optimistic when it comes to gameplay builds. I hope it stays on this trajectory, but after my Dragon Age the Veilguard preview, where I was very optimistic about build quality in that game, yeah, I'm going to take a breath here and just wait to see the final product.
While there is a chance for the game to skyrocket into some crazy quality in a mid-game, there is also non-zero chance that the whole thing is a bait-and-switch kind of strategy. Because we got a very shrewd publisher here and a developer who is most likely past its prime, and they roll out these orchestrated previews with selected set of people to review it instead of, let's say, early access or open beta and such. So it is possible that the whole thing was designed to impress reviewers and journalists with specific section of the game and then use it as a part of marketing campaign. So how would we rate it? Obviously we have to see the whole thing, but let us imagine what kind of rating we would be talking about at this stage. If I were to play it right now and experience content that I see, I would feel that it sits at around 6 out of 10, hoping that they will fix some ugly or broken stuff like lame faces, stupid ropes, useless companions, pronouns, etc. However, the moment I would remember what I had to pay for it, I would drop the score down to 5 out of 10 or maybe even 4 out of 10. Because I have much better ways to spend $70 and better games to experience. The fact that game reviewers often ignore price is just a sign of disconnect from the audience. For an ordinary Steam customer, there will be always a hard choice. Should you buy Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a new Monster Hunter, or Avowed? It is nice to be a big reviewer and get stuff for free, but this is not representative of customers' experience. I strongly believe that reviewers should always address the price of the game. Anyway, congrats on finishing this video, thank you for watching, and I see you later.